Sri Akal ji, kiddha theek thak?
It is so good to see you again.
Very nice to see you as well. You look really well.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the last minute going to India. It's been kind of like crazy. Thank you for accommodating.
Oh, I'm glad that you made time for me. So yeah, we'll have a discussion today about synthesis and how it kind of relates to our education from different. I know that you've traveled a lot, so I'd be interested to know how you synthesized the education from different aspects of your life, as you matured and as you moved from one place to the other. Myself, I was brought up in England, and a lot of my education, well, all of my education practically is very Eurocentric based, and the Sikhi knowledge that I have is informal education. It was information and knowledge that I absorbed from my family and my community, etc. And what I notice is that we sometimes categorize and we put things into boxes, and it's like, this is science and this is art, as though they are very distinct categories with hard borders. And education can be like that every, biology is not the same as social science, and we don't often think about the connections between these. What have you noticed? Do you find yourself putting things into boxes, or have you been able to draw the connections and to integrate the knowledge from different aspects of your life?
So I want to pause and say, explain to me what you mean by synthesis, because that would then I will have a better understanding, so we are on the same page.
Okay, so for me, integration, it's about putting two or more things together to make a whole. That would be integration. So for example, I have been brought up as a British person, and I'm also a Sikh. And so an integration of that is like, there is a part of me that is a Sikh and there's a part of me that is British. And it's as though I'm made up of these two parts. Whereas for me, synthesis is when I look at the complexity and the connections between these two parts. So it's not simply putting those two parts together. It's about looking at that creative complexity that arises, and it's more complex than the two individual parts. So it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That for me is synthesis. It's when we derive something additional from putting these different parts together.
Okay, understood. Yeah, so it's actually looking at a holistic way at everything, what you do and what is it, it's not. And yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the question was, am I this or that? And how do I look at it? How do I look at my journey and the way I view it now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think for me now, at this present stage of my life, I see a connection with just about everything. It is, I don't see myself apart, and as I delve into my own self, I realize that this intimate connection between the universe, between nature and the human. And when I look at nature, the biology, the science, the astronomy, everything comes together. So there's nothing different. I mean, yes, I was born and raised outside India, and I think I struggled with who am I? And for a long time it was, okay, I am an Indian, but I'm not from India. I've lived outside. And yes, I have this education. And it was, the Western side, the Christian side was very strong, the Buddhist side, but they were all in compartments for me because I was studying them, right? And somewhere I think when I would say probably when I went within myself and deepened my own understanding, I realized that there is actually a connection with just about everything. And it isn't just one thing. It is, to a certain extent, it is an amalgamation, but I don't even want to call it that because that makes it less. It is actually a flow. And and I've found that if I am in that flow, I grow. I'm not then boxed. I'm not caged. The mind can then, you become vast. So that to me is, where I look at things in education as well. What is East and what is West? Right now, the education is blending in. It's hard to say whether, and I'm going to use an example, and it's a very poor one, is yoga just from the East? But people who have been born and raised in England, probably the last generation will say, no, it's very much part of our culture too, because it has traveled. It has become mainstream. So when things become mainstream, and that I would say the fear of it being the other is reduced, it becomes easier.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help? I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does. It's like, as you were talking, in my mind, it was like this process of maturation creates that, that synthesis, doesn't it? It's like we can, in our earlier life, we can tend to think, oh, like when I was young and growing up, I thought this is how I behave at home and this is how I behave at school. And it was as though those two worlds were very separate, and they were separate. But as I grew older, as we mature naturally, I find that I'm more of like who I am wherever I am, rather than kind of like shifting wearing these different hats. We become, I suppose it's that confidence that comes from with maturity. I don't see a lot of the younger friends, because my experience wasn't unusual. Most of my friends had that same experience, that they had like one reality that was home and one reality that was school, or a different reality that was work. And as we grow older, I don't see a lot of my friends in older life saying that they are behaving in very different ways. And so it's as though this kind of confidence enables us to synthesize different aspects of our being. But thinking about,
I want to pause there. I don't necessarily agree with that. I understand that, yes, the maturity does that, but it's the individual maturity. Because right now, what I am seeing, it is something which is very concerning within the community, and I speak about this community, is that a different set of standards is applied when they enter the Gurdwara space, right? They would never behave in a corporate setting, raise their voices, and yet in a Gurdwara setting, when they are on the boards and the committees, they have no problem doing that. Now, a parent would never allow a child in a social setting to be running around and doing whatever they wanted to do, right? Yet in the Gurdwara, it seems to be okay. Like the child has carte blanche. So there is still a standard, and that, where that difference is. So yes, when it's not necessarily age that does that, it is actually a conscious effort that you make, who you are, and this is what you represent. So therefore you are the same everywhere in every space.
Yes, I've seen that myself, and it's interesting that, even though we live in very different spaces, we experience similar things, because I noticed that at the Gurdwara as well. I noticed parents leaving their children running around, and and it's like, well, would they do that in in an environment where, like a restaurant, for example? Would they do that? No, they wouldn't do that in a restaurant. So why do they let their children run around in a Gurdwara, which is meant to be a space where everyone can feel at peace? Whereas in a restaurant, they would probably be thrown out for letting their children run around like that. So yes, that's true. And it goes again, to this concept of, well, what is education? and what is the purpose of education. And because I would say that highly educated people, allow their children to misbehave. So it's not a question of like, oh, they're not thinking, they don't have the capacity to think about the consequences on others, because they do. They're professionals, and nevertheless, even though they are professionals and so they are intellectually trained, they don't seem to be conscious of, they don't seem to have the empathy that you would expect a professional to have for others. So what is it about the purpose of education? Like when we become professionals and we claim to have, we do have qualifications in terms of character, do we, is the purpose of education to develop our character? Because I know in Punjabi, like my parents used to say, "Padhya likhya hai, padhya likhya banda," padhya likhya, it was describing their character. That was a wise person almost. Padhya likhya banda was synonymous with somebody being wise and understanding. But have we, is there kind of a shift in terms of, or has it always been the case that even if somebody is highly educated, doesn't necessarily mean that they are conscious of their society and their community and others around them?
That's a great question. You use the word education a broad term. To me right now, I actually feel it's not an education, it's a degree. You go to school to get a degree. You don't go there to get educated. Because everyone says, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer. So you're only focused on that. Education really is opening the mind and expanding yourself and being educated in every sphere of your life, right from your manners to but we've made education a degree for economic success. And that's where the challenge comes in, where you expect that a person with a couple of degrees or 3 or 4 degrees, who is so with this, I would, yes, in a world we could say they would be highly educated, but not necessarily. They are degree educated because they don't have what we call a holistic education, where education in the sense is really to better the human being. Have they done that? So they speak English well, they speak 4 languages, but have they worked on themselves? Are they the kind, compassionate being that education is supposed to do, right? It is, and you speak about your parents, that padhya likhya banda, but let's go back, right? About 80 years, 100 years we've all come from Punjab, that has been our roots. And, when I say undivided Punjab. So the most educated person was the Gyani. He was the person you would go to get your letters read. I mean, I remember that. I mean, I remember my family telling me that. And so think about now where the Gyani is not the most educated person, but at that time, 80 years old, 80 years ago, it was. And so the wisdom came from there. So when your parents say, Padhya likhya, their mindset is on the Gyani, that he was wise and he was educated. The rest of us were struggling. We didn't have the tools. We couldn't make sense of anything. So that's where that is coming from. But right now, I think it is, until we don't recognize that education is really for the entire being, for the human, for the entire self, we will keep getting into this where we are focusing just on degrees. And that's not an education. That's a degree for economic success.
That's right. It's the qualification. It's for material. Very often it's for material gain, isn't it? You get the qualification, then you will get a job, and then you will make lots of money, and then you will train for a higher degree, and then you'll get even more money. So it seems to be very much like instrumental, like the pragmatic, well, we need to buy a house, we need to buy a car, and, it's a means to an end for these products. And during the pandemic, I mean, one of the reasons that I started this project is during the pandemic, I noticed, like we did all over the world, that a lot of people who look like yourself and myself in highly very highly doctors, highly educated doctors and teachers and health workers, even like stratum of society, but they're not in leadership positions, even though they're highly educated. They can be a very specialized doctor or consultant, but they are not leaders. And what is it that is holding them back? Of course, there's systemic racism, there is, the ceiling, we know all that. But at the same time, is there something that we as we're learning to become a medical doctor, are we learning to develop our leadership skills as well? It's not part of the training normally, it's not part, like even as a teacher, you learn to teach, but you don't necessarily learn how to lead as a teacher. Those things come from very often they come through informal means. We learn to develop those skills if we are lucky enough to have mentors in our family, in our community, and we become leaders, but we're not formally taught that. It's not integral unless you go to a university like Oxford and Cambridge, where the leadership skills are part and parcel, in building your character. And so for the majority of us, we tend to, when I was choosing my subjects, which subjects to study, I was advised against studying arts, and it was, like, choose the science subject. And so we elevate science over art because science will give us more money, right? You see. So and then I think to myself, well, what have we got to offer, in terms of our Sikhi? What do we have to offer the global kind of education world place? It's like the West has got science to offer. People will come to the West because they are experts at industrialization, for example. But what do we have to offer? I know we have a lot of wisdom to offer in terms of our Sikhi, but how have we used it? How have we used Sikhi education to create something which is very relevant and which is important in the global environment?
Oh, that was a lot. There were multiple things you mentioned, but what is Sikhi? Well, if you look around right now, the one thing that Sikhi has brought out is this idea of service. Right now, you're seeing that even now in Ukraine, the langar is being run by Sikhs. That is actually the root, is the compassion and the willing to serve. You can be the most brilliant mind, you can industrialize the nations and everything without the compassion. So to me, the holistic, and also what Sikhi teaches is to stand up for the rights for everyone. That very much justice element. So the justice and compassion are actually the roots of society. Without that, you can have an industrialized nation, but a very cold nation that doesn't care for its people. So for me, it is not, the part where we talked about the degrees. What degree can you get out of Sikhi? There is no degree. What education you can get out of Sikhi? How can you educate yourself? Is by believing, is by actually recognizing and following that the divine, the light, is an all. Sabme Jyot and Jyot hai soi. That light is the same. So therefore, there is no need for war, for you to convert anyone. That is an education. For you to say, because we are one, therefore, I must stand. If you are hurting, I am hurting. And to stand with you. And when you have no food to eat, we all suffer. I will be there to serve you. That is an education. That is not a degree.
Mm. That is a very strong part. Seva is a strong part of
No,
Sikhi.
I don't even want to call it seva. It's not seva. It is actually a principle that it's a principle that everyone has the same divine light. And therefore, from that, everything else is derived. Just service without the principle is going to fall through. It is because the principle is so strong.
And Christians are very good at doing that as well. Like they are very, very well organized, and how they have organized the systems to volunteer. We call it seva, and they call it volunteerism. And it's like during the pandemic, there were systems in place throughout every town, every city, to feed the most vulnerable. And so many religions have this. But
I want to pause here. In the Christian faith, it is because they seek conversion, because they want to save you. The voluntarism comes from that element, that that they will be rewarded if they convert you. So let's be very clear about that. In the Sikh faith, there isn't that. So and that's, yes, the systems are in place because they have been around much longer. The church is very strong, right? So they have its mechanisms of actually conversion. And therefore you see in countries, in third world countries, in Africa, in Argentina, and all, where the church is very strong because the missionaries have gone there to do this work. In the Sikh faith, it's not the missionaries that are doing this. It is your average person that is doing this. Without the backing of the Gurdwara, the langars which are in Ukraine are taking place right now. No Gurdwara is backing it. So we need to understand these differences and not, put them all together with one brush, because the principle, we need to recognize that principle, and that's the education, because we come back to it. Otherwise, if we say volunteerism and seva is the same, well, of course, every faith does that. But what's the principle behind it?
Looking after others, and Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would be done by," and
right.
So kindness, and we know that the difference between a highly civilized society and a society which is not as civilized is how they look after the most vulnerable. We look at how they look after their elderly and their disabled, and and those who are homeless. It's like I have a little, my niece's little son, my grandnephew. He says he doesn't want to go to India because he sees homelessness, on TV. That's what he sees. And he said, it's not a very good country. Those are the words of a 7-year-old, because they don't look after their poor, basically. We don't see people suffering in Britain like we see people suffering in India, and so that's kind of like, so then we think about, well, why is it that because India is a highly educated country, there is education for everyone, but if there is education for everyone, then why is it that the systems are still not in place to be looking after the vulnerable more?
Well, that's a political issue, right? So it's now there, whatever the society you've now gotten into the politics of it, of hunger and hunger management, and what all that is involved, and why, also the size of the population, what can be done and what cannot be done. And I hear you use the word civilized, and in the colonial this is a concept. Just because you speak English and you sit on a table and eat your food, you're civilized. Well, there were societies in Africa who were extremely civilized. So who is to judge what is civilization, what is civilized society? So these words which we use, people would say when the British came to India that Indians were uncouth and we civilized them. Really? India had a very, it had its own education system. It had its own medical system. And so to say that, I understand what your 7-year-old grandnephew is saying about the poverty, but poverty is at multiple levels and suffering is at multiple levels. Every society has its own suffering and poverty, but this is very visible. So therefore, a child, it's very jarring and it's hard to take. But to say, why can't India, with its education system, look after its own people? I would say, why can't America, with its wealth and systems in place, look after every homeless person? We have enough wealth here. Yeah. Because there is a willingness of the government in place to do that. It's not that there is not food in this country. And it's the same principle. What is it that the administration believes is the most important thing to fix? And that comes down to education, the compassion. If your government believes that its citizens, the citizens of this country, must be fed, clothed, and shelter, then it will do everything possible for that, to ensure that, right? It will not go out and spend so much money on defense. It can spend the same money on that. So education is actually educating the individual to recognize what makes, and I'm going to borrow your words, a civilized society, a society where all are equal, treated equally, and there is enough to eat for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I do understand your point about the word civilized, and I'm using it through a British lens, of course.
Right.
And one of the reasons that the Western, from the Western lens, they thought that our education is not as sophisticated as the scientific method and, the Newtonian kind of style of education based on logic, is that mythology. There's this kind of tendency to take mythology, to elevate mythology as opposed to elevating the logic. And that was taken to be one of the reasons why, I started off by talking about science versus art. In art, mythology has a place, whereas in science, mythology doesn't have a place. And it's as though we have kind of taken these two very different styles of thought, and we haven't synthesized them. We have said that is civilized. Civilization is based on the scientific method, the Newtonian atomistic kind of, which has led to the industrial revolutions. That is advancement, whereas mythology, art, that's all well and good as a hobby, as a exotic kind of interest that you may have, but it's not going to lead to advancement. And we can say, well, look at India, those beliefs in mythology, do they work in terms of material advancement? And so the US, it's the epitome of material advancement, isn't it? And there's a focus on the scientific method. There's a focus on, science rather than arts, and not a focus on mythology. And so we look at these two different civilizations and we see one path, you follow that path if you want material advancement, and you follow the other if you want to remain kind of like trapped in one's past.
I know you've, and I'm going to bring it back to Barney. In Gurbani, Guru says that you can read as many books as you want, and you can be the top-notch scholar, and you can have all the information of the Vedas and everything, right? But unless you don't have the experience, you're nothing. Because past the knowledge, what actually that education is a deep knowing. And that deep knowing is what brings contentment, happiness, and joy. So when you look at the logic will only take you to a certain place, but logic can never make you happy because it is outside you. And I mean, I know you use the word mythology, and I'm sure it is an educated word, but it is really, for me, it is the experience. I can give you a piece of fruit. I can give you a mango. I can describe that mango to you, the etymology of the word. I can give you the the biology of it, and tell you the structure of it. And you can write a paper on this fruit of the mango and all the properties and everything about it. But then I cut the mango and I say, I want you to now taste the fruit. And it is when you taste the fruit and you taste the juice and everything, and then what you produce will be very different for every being, right? And that's the experience. And you will always have that experience, and it will retain with you and it will bring you joy. There is the one part where the logic part is, you know exactly how this principle works. And the other part is the application. And both need to go together. And that is what the individual is. If you have the logic, but you cannot apply the logic in your life, if you have the education, but if you cannot apply the education to better your life and to better the lives of everyone, that logic, that education is meaningless.
Absolutely. It's like the objective truth versus the subjective truth. And I agree with you that we have to have both objective and subjective, whereas there are many educators who, they're just tunnel kind of visioned, and they say no, objective, like if something is subjective, it's not really scientific if it's subjective. And then others will say, well, everything has to be interpreted and it has to be experienced, and we don't, it's like, well, obviously we need both, we need both fact and fiction.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because you need to know why the earth moves, and then you need to experience the stars, right? So there's the experience, but there's also a star by itself, but by logic is not going to move you. But a star, by looking in the creative side, the experiencing side, will move you, and you will write about it, and you will paint about it, and that will move society, right?
Yes, you see, the thing is that people like Leonardo da Vinci, he was both a mathematician and an artist. And when we look at geniuses like him, they were both scientists and artists. They used all of their brain. They didn't use just a fragment of their brain. They used the whole brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we are complex beings. And that's what Gurbani says, it's the duality. If you just say you're going to focus on that, there's this constant struggle within you. If you accept the whole, whatever comes, I'm going to embrace it. I'm looking and not making the mind so powerful that the mind doesn't listen to the heart. So in Gurbani, there are 90% of the Shabads are directed towards the mind, because the mind is the one that is directing, and the mind is the one that's not listening to the heart. The heart always knows what is right.
Yes, and most of it is poetry. It's stories and it's poetry. And again, like according to the logic, it's like, well, that story can be or that poetry can be interpreted in so many different ways, and so what is the actual kind of absolute truth? Does it mean this or does it mean that? As though there has to be one interpretation, and depending on our context, even one sentence, depending on where we are in our lives and location spatially and whatever, it will have a very different meaning, and that meaning will be unique to us. But again, it's this separation, it's this categorization. Well, this is poetry and this is logic, and the two are very distinct, and there can be logic even within the poetry, can't there?
Yeah, and this, when you were talking, and this is the logic is where production can take place, right? You can have a factory run each individual doing just a certain part and not looking at the whole thing. And they just from morning to night are just filling in those packets, and that's it. And that's the industrialization. That is the thing. And that is not the growth of the individual. That is not the happiness of the individual. That is actually death. Yes, you're getting a paycheck, but internally you are dying. So is that education? Is that, where the brightest minds, so-called brightest minds, have created these industrial models for the human beings to be put in a production line, to actually kill them, to kill their spirit and make them mindless. Is that what education is about?
Well, this is what Marx called alienation, didn't he? So the whole kind of socialist movement based on Marxist theories were about, like a protest against alienation, but then they continue to alienate. They continue to, it's like every socialist country I know, it continues to alienate the workers. And that alienation is the opposite of connectedness, isn't it?
Yes.
And so this is what, like Guru Harai, he was a contemporary of Newton. He was Guru from 1644. Newton was born in 1643, so they were both contemporaries. And we have Guru Harai talking about advocating environmentalism, our connectedness, the oneness with nature. And then we have the logical, the scientific method, the beginnings of alienation, where it's as though the world is simply a machine that can be analyzed and used to create, to be very productive. And it's as though we have forgotten about the teachings of our Sikh and this oneness in practical life, because we look at the Punjab now, and so much of the land is depleted. There's deforestation, there's I read somewhere that there's supposed to be about 30% tree coverage, and it's only about 3%. So they're cutting the trees down. They're not kind of taking that strategic kind of approach of if we're making more profit now, how is it going to feed the grandchildren? They're not taking that kind of holistic view. So where have we, overlooked and forgotten about the teachings of Sikhi in terms of our oneness and in terms of being at one with nature and not abusing it, remaining connected with it?
Greed.
Mm-hmm.
When we become individualistic. And that's what today's education teaches us, that the individual is more powerful, is more important than the community. When we place the individual more, higher than the greater good, that's where we have this type of thinking. Instead of bringing everyone along, and this is where leadership comes in, right? Leaders are what? Chosen, what you're going to follow. There's a servant leadership model where in the group, in Sikhi it is Gurchela, right? It's that servant leadership model, which is not there in the West. In the West, one is the leader and the rest will follow. It's changing now, absolutely it's changing, where they're talking about collaboration. You talked about leadership skills that you don't learn. Leadership skills, actually a true leader comes from the community, within the structure, within your school system. Because you have dealt with certain situations in a profound way, in a way that everyone looks to you, those are what we call the leadership traits. Yes, you can go to school, you can go to Oxford and be taught leadership, but if it's not ingrained in you, if it doesn't come from within you, there will always be that duality. Intellectually, I know I'm supposed to take everyone's opinion around the table and have a consensus, but my behavior is very rude. And and my presence doesn't allow that to happen. Intellectually, I know them. I have got everyone around the table, but practically it's not working. So leadership is actually, each one of us has leadership qualities, are leaders. It is just the confidence level. When you believe in yourself and then you are allowed to express that in your environment, That's how leadership actually grows. And it's not to say that, you know, that every person will succeed, every leader, what you call, who's been through a training, will succeed in every situation. The answer is no, because every industry, every environment is different, requires a different method, different behavior. So, you know, I'm not of the opinion that we need leaders. I'm of the opinion we need everyone to be a leader, to recognize their qualities and for them to feel confident enough to be able to share. That's the growth. That's where uplifting everyone. And that's the greatest ideas come from, that collaboration, when there is no fear amongst people to speak to each other and that their idea is going to be rejected because someone will say, this is a brainless idea. Even that brainless idea, if you think, might trigger something else in somebody else.
You've said those words, presence and confidence, and those are key words. It's like when I asked you, what is the purpose of education? When I asked that question to my teachers, it's like to my teenagers, when I was teaching in London, my teenagers would always say, well, I want to go to university. And then what? Well, then I want to buy a house. Then I want to buy a car. Then I want to, it is always like leading to a material kind of outcome product. But you talk about presence, you talk about confidence, and that's what I would say to them. Well, no, it's not the qualification that matters as much as the confidence that you will have as a result of that. So the qualification is simply a means to an end. But a leader is somebody who has a great deal of presence, which is an energy. It's not a tangible product, but it comes from confidence. It comes from love. Somebody who, the people who are serving langar to those in need, there has to be a tremendous amount of compassion, which is again like an energy, isn't it? It's not a tangible thing. It's an energetic thing that drives them. It motivates them. It gets them out of bed. That's the real purpose of education. But we seem to have kind of overlooked that and made it about tangible outcomes such as the qualification, which you could have a qualification but have no confidence, and then you won't get the job that you want because you don't have the confidence.
Right. And and it's unfortunately we celebrate the degrees, we don't celebrate the individuals. And it's changing, but when the children come to me and ask, I always tell them, we're going to college, take whatever you want to take, but do take something in humanities. And the word humanities is really important because those courses make you human, enhance those qualities of where you become a human being, and the hues within you, the colors within you come out. You can't just say, I am this.
That's true. And again, it's like a lot of these values that we don't learn them in class. We learn them through the people that we're close to. We learn we absorb these things. And it's like, I remember one of my teacher colleagues who wanted to do exercises, group work exercises to develop teamwork skills, they said, and a lot of our students come from India and China and they don't like doing group work, and they were saying but they have to do these group exercises to develop their teamwork skills. And my response to that was, well, they don't come all this way paying thousands of pounds to do group work exercises to develop teamwork skills, because they already have developed these skills in their families and their communities. And these are cultures where those kind of skills are very prioritized, I suppose. And then, but at the same time, we were talking about the individualism, that on one hand, it can seem as though both India and China are countries where the collective is very important. But then when we look at crises, like for example, the Ukraine, I have heard that there are 16,000 Indian students stuck in the Ukraine with no way of no one's really helping them. So where are the systems in terms of crisis, like during times of crisis, why is the government not doing what the British government is doing? For example, if there's anybody British in the Ukraine, the British government will go in and take them out. Why is the Indian government not doing that? Even though we would like to say that it's a very kind of collective kind of culture, that we're not individualistic, but is that really true?
No, well, it comes down to the value of the individual, right? It is because the government does not put value on its citizens. And that's what it is. It's where are they going to spend their money on? The individual is not valued. It's the collective. The collective means the country is more important than the individual. So therefore, everything is done for that.
And then let's look at education then. So we gained independence in 1947 on a physical level, but it seems as though in terms of education, we continue to use British education, and the legal system is still based on the British system, for example. So, we fought for such a long time for independence, and yet in terms of education, it seems as though we have maintained that colonialism.
Yep, and that's why you have these problems, because the British laws do not gel with the Indian culture, with the culture of the land. So it's an imposition, and they don't make sense. But the work, and this is where the investment comes in, the work that needs to be done. 75 years is still very young for a so-called democracy, particularly through the turmoil. And we haven't had the wise leaders who have invested. I mean, we've got a system of education which actually doesn't work for a large part of the population. It's foreign to them.
But they will pay for it. You see, they will pay, because I even have relatives, children of my cousins who are sent to an English school, and pay, it's expensive. So people will pay big sums of money for an English education, and the land is being depleted, and there's hardly, from what I can gather, not much interest in environmentalism, until the West will say environmentalism is really important, and they will import that education from the West. But we've known that for thousands of years.
Yeah, but we lost the confidence, right? When you are subjugated for a period of time, you actually become mental slaves. So colonialism is slavery. And then now to unshackle it and then relearn it takes time. There are people, but there's not enough, because the people in power, and power is heady. Nobody wants things to change. Nobody wants the status quo to change, because it means their power will change, right? And therefore, the work which you're talking about requires wisdom and really looking at what is needed for the country, what is needed, and you can do it village by village, town by town. It doesn't need to be, and it's never going to be top down. Certain villages adopt certain principles, that we will not have liquor stores in our village. Certain villages adopt, no, we will not burn the fields. Certain villages adopt, we will not use the pesticide. Certain villages adopt that we will send all children, even the girls, to school. Certain villages adopt certain principles. And that becomes then, as the villages in India, I'm talking about particularly, that's when there will be a shift. But a shift from top down will not work. But everything right now, we are so geared. I mean, I'm not talking about just India, but we as individuals are so geared to a materialistic world where we want the things, that we are just going for the degrees. Very few are looking at really education in the sense of being educated human beings, where the human, the different colors which we all have, are accepted and embraced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we started talking about synthesis and making connections between our British education or European education and the Sikhi education, and I remember when I was taught about the Reformation and Martin Luther and how the Protestant religion became established, and I saw similarities between Guru Nanak Dev Ji and Martin Luther, because they were contemporaries and they both seem, even though they never met, this is like incredible. I was like fascinated by how is it that these two men who never met in, even though they were contemporaries, they never met, even though Guru Nanak traveled all over he traveled to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and, far-flung kind of areas, but he didn't come to Europe as far as I know. But their ideology was similar in terms of like direct relationship with God and the work ethic, Girt Kamau and Martin Luther, it's like the work ethic, the Protestant work ethic, and so many similarities. And Protestantism has spread all around the world, and Sikhi has spread all around the world. And I could see kind of the similarities, but in a way, like now when I look at it, it's like, are we kind of too too focused on how similar we are to the West, rather than kind of like thinking about, well, yeah, these are the similarities, but what about these other unique things that, like, for example, Guru Nanak Dev Ji advocated equality, gender equality, which Martin Luther didn't. He didn't talk about that. So, and there are other things like the environmentalism, for example. I don't see how in the Reformation they weren't talking about the oneness. And so there are, when we become so focused on the scientific method and industrialization, it's as though we have forgotten about all these other things that are precious about the knowledge, but which, because they're not similar to the Western thought, it's as though we have kind of put them on a back burner.
It actually is. I get when I speak at non-Sikh forums, and I'm always asked, well, why isn't this known? Why isn't this about equality, gender, the place of women, and all that? Why isn't this known? Because this is radical, right? Why isn't it known is because it didn't travel out of Punjab. And when people, the ones who did travel out, language was the barrier, English, right? So now, where language is not the barrier, we are traveling out. There's still a hesitation because we don't want to appear different. We want to appease. And we say, okay, yeah, we only want to talk about things which are similar. Because it's more comfortable. We don't want to challenge the establishment, because we don't consider ourselves as equals. When we begin to consider ourselves equal and to have an equal space at the table, and have the confidence to bring the ideas which we've had for 550 plus years, that is the education. That is it. Until then, it's like actually putting band-aids and not really accepting, not really embracing the wisdom of Sikhi.
I suppose there's also the element that we do have to walk the walk, because yes, Guru Nanak Dev Ji did create this radical kind of gender equality, but do we practice it?
That's right. Until you don't see women in leadership roles in Gurdwara, it is just it's a mere lip service, right?
It's an idea, isn't it? Yes, it
isn't it? Mm-hmm. And when you see that leadership role, and when you see Gurdwaras globally, and I don't mean one Gurdwara, I mean globally, that is then everybody looking in, wow, there are women in leadership positions. How come that happened? Right now, people are talking about Sikhs and Langar because ordinary Sikhs are practicing it. It is taking effect. Like, what is this principle? There are studies being done. that motivates the Sikhs to do this. So therefore the principle comes in. So unless we do not live the principles, we cannot expect.
Same with environmentalism.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
If we don't honor, if Punjab itself, the land, does not live by doesn't honor the principles, and it's not up to the individuals. You have a government, and the different factors, but that is what it is. It is when the environment, when the principles of the faith or the principles of everything are put into practice, and they become very visible. That's when people come to you to study you. That is when people come to say, what happened here? Show us. Tell us how you did it.
That's right. Like, for example, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he did put the teachings into practice in terms of diversity. He created a very diverse culture, didn't he? And equality between the different cultures. So that's why he was a very successful Maharaja during his lifetime. At least for 40 years, he was highly successful because he was actually putting into practice the ideology. Whereas since Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, sometimes we have been allies of unethical practices. Like, for example, in 1857, during the uprising, the first mutinies, the Sikhs were actually helping the British.
Yeah.
You see, and so for self-interest, because they were being rewarded, therefore they were given land, and they were, so through self-interest, they betrayed their fellow, Indians, didn't they?
Yeah, and it's the principles, right? So it is when but also it was when the British in the army, and the British army said that all had to wear the helmets. The regiment people resigned from the regiments and left the regiments and said, well, we will not do that, at a great cost to them. Mm-hmm. So it is when you decide to take a stand, when you create a movement, when enough do that, then that is like, okay, what is happening here? We need to understand, we need to study, we need to do this. But so long as we start, I would say, agreeing or appeasing things for economic gains or political or social gains, we will never be able to get ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a short time, yes, but we will lose out on a lot.
Mm-hmm. And then, finally, like, there's this comparison between Gandhi and Bhagat Singh. Like, most of my teachers know who Gandhi is, but none of them know who Bhagat Singh is. And when we look at the life of Bhagat Singh, he was executed at the age of 23, and he was an atheist. He wrote a book, I Am an Atheist, and he was very much influenced by Marxism. He identified as being a socialist, but in a way I see him as being a Sikh because he was practicing the principles of equality. He wanted freedom for everyone, not just for his own community. He wanted freedom regardless of what a person's religion was, which I think is the principle of Sikhi that Guru Nanak Dev Ji taught. And so there. But it didn't work. It's like he was executed, and he was very young. He was only 23 years old. And then it's this thing of like, well, we can't just take one principle. We have to look at the complexity, and there can't be wisdom with only courage. He obviously had a great deal of courage, but was there wisdom that went along with that courage? And so
situations demand different things. And I would say with Gandhi it suited him to become nonviolent because when he was in Africa, his writings were very racist, right? And also with Gandhi it's what we call, the British have a love affair with him, because he was this man, but they did not understand. It's all coming out now. But he was a complex man, and we are all complex beings. So why we don't know about Bhagat Singh is because we haven't told the story in the way to capture the imagination, right? At the end of the day, it is education, it is capturing the imagination, it is visual. When Gandhi came to England, this frail man in a dhoti captured the imagination of the British women. They couldn't wait to take out their coats and clothe this man. Mm-hmm. That's the power of media. That's the power of visual. And, Bhagat Singh's life needs to be, it's hard because Bhagat Singh's life makes you question that somebody so young who went through so much because he believed in a principle, right? He died for a principle. Am I willing to die for that? Is my conviction that strong enough? When you're young, you are invincible.
Yeah, from what I can gather, because on one hand, it seems as though Gandhi was more strategic in his vision, that he was thinking more long term, his kind of the non-cooperation or that movement that he led, it took at least 50 years for it to kind of, produce any kind of outcome. But so in one way, like, it could seem as though Gandhi's way was wiser because it was strategic, it was long term. In a way, I think that Bhagat Singh, perhaps, I'm just guessing this, maybe that was strategic as well, because he knew that in being executed, there would be an impact.
And he would awaken a consciousness of people.
Yes.
The ones who were sleeping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it seems that in that respect, he was also strategic. Because he knew, during that time, he was just as popular as Gandhi was, but he knew that in order to awaken that consciousness, something like his execution would, so that in a sense is strategic as well, isn't it?
Yep. And that's what it is. It's when you're in the moment, in the time period, in the context, what is needed and what will, jar the public consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, look, there's so many kind of things that we could continue to talk about, and but I think sometimes there isn't enough opportunity to debate and discuss these things, which these are very important issues in our own lives. But where is the forum to make these connections? And it's like, why does everyone know about Gandhi and why don't they know about Bhagat Singh? And it's like, to ask these questions, and when we ask these questions, we don't have to find an immediate solution, but simply in asking the question, there's an impact, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And it's when you ask the questions, then maybe somebody in the audience, or maybe somebody who's listening who's said, I want to do a paper on it, or I want to do a play on it, or I want to take a piece of his life and make it into X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. That's all what educators can do, is to put that seed in, right? That's the idea. How that seed will nurture, how anybody will take it, that's the individual.
Yeah, because it's like in 1931, Bhagat Singh was executed, and it's about 100 years later, and we're talking about him.
Yeah.
You see, so he left a legacy, right?
Well, around that time also, he was scary in the sense, not parents didn't want their children to know because they didn't want them to become Bhagat Singhs. So, you need that space as well.
Yes.
No, let me tell you, no parent wanted their child to be a Bhagat Singh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ask a parent now, they say, no. Yeah, you can do a little bit of activism, but we don't have to go down that path.
Mm. Yeah. And well, even in this day and age, it's like if we elevate someone like Bhagat Singh, people could accuse us of being extremist.
Right.
Still seen as being an extremist,
Right. And yet the life is inspirational. Mm-hmm. A life that he lived on the principles, and the question comes, do we have a principle that we would be willing to die for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But there is just so much richness in our knowledge that we have, and it's about focusing on it now and watering those seeds so that Punjab is no longer kind of continues to be depleted and deforested and prone to droughts and whatever. It's about kind of nurturing the land that we have, and to actually use the wisdom to make it sustainable.
Yes. And may your words spread far and wide, and may the ears that need to listen to them hear them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I wish you a very peaceful journey back home. And
Thank you.
And I look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, excellent. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay.